So my name is Durant Ashmore. I'm a seventh generation South Carolinian. I'm a Greenville County boy. My fourth great grandparents were the original pioneers in Greenville County. And I'm descended from Henry Durant, my namesake, one of Marion's men. And I'm also descended from Colonel William Valentine. Colonel Valentine was with the Dutch Fork Loyalist militia. So I've got family on both sides of this conflict we're going to begin to talk about. I've always been interested in history. I've always been interested in military history. I love, how the battles evolved, and I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit. But there's more to it than just the military history, and I'm going to be talking about the events that led up to the Revolutionary War. I'm going to be talking about that tonight. With the Revolutionary War, it's other things that I do. I'm a battlefield preservationist. I have been a landscape contractor and designer and nurseryman for the past 43 years. And I've combined my interest in history along with my experiences maintaining and managing landscapes. And I graduated from Greenville High School a long time ago, graduated from Furman University, got a master's in landscape architecture from University of Georgia. And I've also got a graduate minor in historic preservation. So I do have some training in how to manage historic landscapes. And I've been able to apply that with the work that I've been doing at various battlefields throughout the backcountry. One thing I want y'all to realize is that really we are walking in the footsteps of history. There is so much Revolutionary War history that has occurred right here. Within 50 miles of where we are, there were 100 Revolutionary War battles. And many people, I didn't realize that. I did not realize that. There's no place in America that can say that. I mean, we really are in the heart of it. And some of these smaller battlefields that I manage and preserve are Fort Thickety in Cherokee County, 3 of them in Lawrence County, Fort Lindley, Hayes Station, and Hammond's Old Store. On the Clemson campus is Fort Rutledge, and there's other battlefields that I'm looking at and managing as well. One thing as far as this series that I'm beginning to begin tonight, I use these lectures, and I do lecture throughout the entire backcountry, Spartanburg, Lawrence, Greenville, Greenwood, other areas. I use these lectures as preparation for field trips that we take to these different battlefields. And I have 15 battlefield field trips set up, and I hope that y'all can join me on these. That's where the action is. That's where we walk in the footprints of history. And we'll be talking about that some more. At the end of the program, I've got a very exciting field trip to undertake this weekend at a battlefield that has just been discovered in Donald, South Carolina, just been discovered about 6 weeks ago. So I do volunteer work. Everything I do is on a volunteer basis. I work extensively with the South Carolina Battleground Trust, and the Battleground Trust has a field research team of some of the finest battlefield detectors in South Carolina. And because these individuals are so well versed in finding battlefields in South Carolina, they are the best battlefield detectors in America. Because there are more battlefields in South Carolina than any other state. As many as 500 different Revolutionary War events occurred in South Carolina. and we're going to be talking about quite a few of them. Last year, I did a 12-month program talking about the Revolutionary War in South Carolina. Now, I've condensed that to undertake a 4-part program, which I'm getting ready to begin here tonight. So it's going to be a lot of information. The 12 months for me was a little bit drawn out, but I'm going to have things compacted, but still I want you to see those battlefields. Now, I also mentioned that I communicate so much with my friends in this field. I communicate through Facebook. So if you are on Facebook, send me a friend request and you'll have a schedule of all the activities that I do undertake. And I do something about once every couple of weeks. So a lot going on. I've delved into this head over heels, and I love it, and I have a feeling y'all love it too, or you wouldn't be here tonight. So to get started, I will show you one of my favorite pictures pertaining to the Revolutionary War. And this is the scene at the end of the Battle of Cowpens. And this individual here is William Washington, Colonel William Washington, George Washington's second cousin once removed. So I think highly of William Washington. He has fought here in the backcountry of South Carolina. He fought at Hammond's Store, and he was such a hero at Cowpens and numerous other encounters as well. I specialize in the 96th district. Pickens County was not in the 96th district. The 96th district comprises 10 western counties in the state of South Carolina. Edgefield, McCormick, Abbeville, Newberry, Lawrence, Greenwood, Spartanburg, parts of Cherokee County, parts of York County. Pickens, Oconee, Anderson, and Greenville counties were Cherokee territory during the Revolutionary War. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the 96 settlers and the backcountry of South Carolina. Pickens technically isn't involved in that, but I want y'all to consider yourselves part of the backcountry as I continue this discussion. So another character that I'm fond of who is in this picture and who fought throughout the backcountry of South Carolina is this fellow right here. And his name is Colin. He's 14 years old. He is William Washington's bugler. There's his bugle right there. He was constantly at William Washington's side. He is described as an individual too small, too puny to wield a sword. And that's why he's armed with the pistol here. And here in the background, you've got Cornet Patterson getting ready to chop the head off of our hero, William Washington. Except that Colin is saving his life as he's wounding Cornet Patterson with his pistol. And I hope my pointer holds up throughout the evening. Colin fought, he's always at William Washington's side because that's how orders were given on the battlefield. You know, right flank, left flank, retreat, attack, whatever. Colin had to be beside William Washington's side. And they fought well together at Hammond's Old Store, which is a battlefield that we're going to see and we're going to be discussing a lot throughout the course of events. He fought at Cowpens, as this scene indicates, and Colin also fought at Guilford Courthouse, where unfortunately Colin was killed. But over a 2.5 month period, Colin was a very important figure to William Washington's 3rd Continental Light Dragoons. So, to begin at the beginning, you know, we're going to be talking about South Carolina colonial history. I've only got 4 programs to try to get this across to you, and here I'm spending 25% of that time talking about the beginnings and the reasons for the Revolutionary War. When I'm on these battlefields and I'm walking these sites, I'm always asking myself, why? And I hope that I can explain to you throughout this series an understanding of why. And to understand that, we do need to start at the beginning. And the beginning in South Carolina of European settlement and contact occurred in 1524, when Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon sailed into Winyaw Bay, which is where Georgetown is, and interacted with the Winyaw tribe that was there. So here's one of the Winyaw Native Americans, and all of a sudden he's observing 3 Spanish ships arising in the bay. Vasquez de Ayllon invited 60 of the Winyaw tribe onto his ships and showed them around, and promptly pulled up anchor and sailed into the Caribbean, where he sold them into slavery. So this is the first contact with Native Americans in South Carolina with European culture. And the other factor that's so important about what happened during this time is the fact that European diseases were transmitted to the Native Americans. It is estimated that at the time of first contact, there were 10 million Native Americans in America. By the time the Revolutionary War started, there were 1 million Native Americans. 90% of the population died due to European diseases, and that's primarily smallpox. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in 1623, they referred to it as the land of skulls and bones, because there were not enough living people to bury the dead. And disease is an important factor in this entire history that we're talking about. Armies were decimated due to diseases. Leaders were knocked down due to the diseases that came through. It was pretty rough. Malaria, yellow fever, and smallpox were the primary diseases that took such a heavy toll. These are the original Native American tribes in South Carolina. You can see outlined in red here, this is the Cherokees. The Cherokees are a very important part of our story, extremely important. The Cherokees are extremely important as far as Pickens County history is concerned. This was Cherokee territory, and I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit. The other primary tribe in South Carolina was the Catawbas. They went up into North Carolina. The Cherokees went to western Georgia, eastern Tennessee, western Virginia, somewhat into Kentucky, somewhat into West Virginia. These other tribes down here, these small individual tribes, these are Muskogean tribes. The Creeks, which were major enemies of the Cherokees, they were Muskogean. The Catawbas were Sioux-based tribe. The Cherokees were Iroquois. And the Cherokees were enemies with almost every one of these other tribes. And it was particularly prevalent with the Catawbas. When the Cherokees were allies with one particular group, the Catawbas were the enemies, and the vice versa. It just virtually, you know, if whoever this guy was for, I'm going to be against them. That's about the way the thought process went. The Broad River runs down through here. That was considered the traditional boundary between the Cherokees and the Catawbas. These are the river systems of South Carolina. The rivers were extremely important in colonial times and during Revolutionary War. You know, we see the Savannah River down through here. Here's the Saluda coming in, and it joins with the Broad River. The Broad River drains Charlotte all the way down. Where the Broad and the Saluda join together, then that forms the Congaree River. This area between the Saluda and the Broad is referred to as the Dutch Fork. So we'll be talking about that. This is the Catawba River. When it comes down, there's a little river, little creek that comes in, the Wateree Creek. When the Wateree Creek comes into the Catawba River, the name changes to the Wateree River. And as the Wateree River joins the Congaree River, that name is changed to the Santee River. The Santee River basin, the watershed, is the second biggest watershed in the coast, on the east coast of the United States. It drains a large area. Then another major river is the Petey here. Once it gets into North Carolina, it's known as the Yadkin. Francis Marion worked in the area of the Petey River. Here's Lynch's Creek, where Lynch's Creek came into the Petey. That's where Snow Island was. That was Francis Marion's sanctuary. Other rivers, we'll talk about the Stono River a little bit later on, and there's Ashley River, and there's the Cooper River. I want you to notice this area right through here. What rivers are we crossing? None. Very good. Somebody gets an A. That area, that's the watershed between the Savannah to the south and the Santee to the north. That is the Cherokee Path. That is the way that the Cherokees from Pickens County, and then Kiowa was the capital of the Cherokees. It was just across the county line in Oconee County. But that's the way the Cherokees interacted with the settlers in Charleston. They walked that path. Now, you know this path because from Columbia down to Charleston, that's I-26. You take the Cherokee Path. And further up this way is Highways 76 and 28. So you're familiar with that. And if you'll notice, 26 from Columbia to Charleston does not cross any major rivers. These rivers were choke points during the Revolutionary War when we get to that point. From where we are now, there was not a single bridge within 150 miles of here. The closest bridges to the backcountry of South Carolina were in Kingstree and in Monk's Corner, which is somewhere around in there. So here, where the river was swollen or not, where the ferries were, where the fords were, this played a vital role in Revolutionary War activities. So this is, early settlement of Charleston. This is where White Point Gardens would be. The original settlement was Charlestown Landing, and after about 10 years, the settlers decided that this was a more favorable location. And just another, view of Charleston here. Now, everybody from South Carolina needs to realize, and probably does realize, this point right here is one of the most important points in world history of all. This is where the Ashley River comes together with the Cooper River. And that's where the Atlantic Ocean is formed. Did y'all not know that? As settlement developed, and there are several things I'm going over quickly. We could spend an hour on every one of these pictures, but this shows the tidal basins of the state of South Carolina. What's in white is where it was extremely advantageous to grow rice. The first imported crop of South Carolina was indigo, but the second was rice, and rice was extremely profitable, especially through the use of slaves. And many of these rice plantations had as many as 400 slaves at a time. When the Revolutionary War started, there were 105,000 enslaved persons in South Carolina. There were 75,000 Europeans in South Carolina. So, and one of my lectures is the role of slavery in the American Revolution, and I'm going to be touching on points of that throughout the discussion as it develops. But the Revolutionary War was a terrible time to be an enslaved person. Slaves were the spoils of war. Plantations were raided to, plunder the slaves and then sell them at great profit. The slaves were the most valuable properties in the state, much more valuable than land or anything else. That's where wealth was measured by the number of slaves that you had. You couldn't hold office unless you held a certain number of slaves. This is the Yamasee War. There's a series of conflicts with the Native Americans. Again, we'll get into this in more detail. I just wanted you to know that in 1715 there was a war with the Yamasee Indians. 1680 there was a war with the Westo Indians. Two battles that defeated the Yamasee here. I did want to point out Tougaloo, which is on the border with Oconee County and Georgia. This was where the Creeks and the Cherokees had a conference to decide basically who were they going to support and who they weren't going to support in this Native American War, which actually extended all the way along the coast, along the East Coast. In North Carolina, it's referred to as the Tuscarora War. When this conference occurred, there were 11 Creek leading men visiting with the Cherokee delegation, and by the time it was over with, the Creek delegation was murdered. So that does give some indication of the animosity that occurred between those two groups. But the Native American wars were constantly on the mind of the European settlers here in South Carolina. This is the map of the Stono River right below Charleston. In 1739, there was a slave revolt, the Stono Revolt, where 50 slave persons under the leadership of a slave from the Congo named Jimmy. He was a charismatic figure. He was one of the few enslaved people who could read and write. And a slave who could read and write was a huge threat to the slave owners. What was probably a bigger threat of all is that Jimmy was Catholic, since the Congo was Portuguese. The Catholics, were not in South Carolina at all until after the Revolution. The British had a serious problem with Catholics and would hardly allow Catholics to be in the colony. But those 50 enslaved persons tried to retreat all the way down to Florida, where they would have sanctuary, but they were caught and they were all killed. 25 white Europeans were killed during this time. The Yamasee War, the Stono Rebellion were events that were constantly on the mind of the British colonial authorities and the settlers as well. I'm showing you this map just to give you a little bit of an idea of some of the geography. There are some features on this map that are interesting. You can see Fort Prince George up here. Again, that's Pickens County. This is one of the most noted features of all of Pickens County. And I feel like the role of Fort Prince George in colonial South Carolina should really be highlighted. And I would think and hope that folks from Pickens County, understand and create an interest for development of whatever we can do to illustrate what happened here at Fort Prince George. This is not entirely accurate showing the Cherokee lands. The Cherokee lands kind of went up this way, and then the border between Greenville and Spartanburg County is here, and I'll show you a little bit more detail later on. 96, hugely important. Long Canes development. The Long Canes got its name because the river cane along the banks of the Long Cane Creek grew 20 and 30 feet tall. And the early settlers in the state of South Carolina realized that everywhere that river cane grew, corn would thrive. Corn and river cane are in the same family. So the early settlers looked for the cane breaks. And where the Native Americans had not burned them off and used them for their agricultural fields, that's where the early settlers did as well. So the Long Canes area is some of the most fertile land in the state. You can see here, this line here defines the backcountry versus the low country. Anything from Camden is somewhere around here, Orangeburg, somewhere around over here, there's Orangeburg. Anything beyond Camden and Orangeburg is referred to as the backcountry. And I'll be using this slide here to describe the Cherokee culture and the way that the Cherokee culture and the Cherokee understanding and the European culture, those two cultures could simply not understand each other. It was bound for conflicts. The mind of each other just could not comprehend what the other was thinking. The Cherokees were a matrilineal society. So what does that mean? It means that you belong to the clan of your mother. The clans that's how Cherokee life was regulated. And it had been regulated for centuries very effectively this way. A healthy Cherokee town usually had about 100 homes in it. They had a large council house, and there would be 7 clans. There would be the Wolf Clan, which is primarily the warriors, the Deer Clan, they would be the hunters, the Bird Clan, the messengers, the Paint Clan, they were the healers, the Long Hair Clan, they were the peacemakers, the Blue Clan, they painted the body blue because they felt like that gave them protection and was healthy. So every Cherokee belonged to the clan that his mother belonged to. And it meant that mothers chose their husbands with the blessing of the beloved woman who was the leader of the clan. Cherokee maidens chose their husbands based on the physical attributes of that individual. And if she wanted to live with him for a while, she could live with him for a while. If she ever got tired of him and wanted to divorce him, all she had to do was flick her wrist, and that was it. He was gone. Cherokee fathers, Native American fathers, most of the Native American fathers, did not raise their children. Now, how foreign is that to European way of thought? Fathers did not raise their children. Children were raised by the brothers of the mother. Children were raised by their uncles. Now, it's not that these Cherokee husbands were out just lollygagging around. They were raising their sisters' children. And by doing this, you raised children in the ways of the clan. And each clan had their particular way of doing things. So, the way that Cherokee justice worked, it was based on an eye for an eye. And if there was a transgression committed, they had different levels of punishment. One of the levels was shunning. They just wouldn't talk to a particular individual, and that's no fun. Another punishment was banishment. There was actually a town that was set aside just for banished folks if the transgression was more serious. And if the transgression was something like murder, then again, this is an eye for an eye type situation. So if someone in the Deer clan killed somebody else in the Deer clan, it was totally up to the Deer clan to decide what that punishment was going to be. And none of the other clans had any business deciding that. So say that somebody from the Deer clan killed somebody from the Wolf clan. Then it was up to the Wolf clan to exact punishment on the Deer clan. And it did not have to be the murderer. It could have been, it was someone of equal rank. So, you know, that's the way it worked between the clans. And so if somebody from the Wolf clan killed somebody from the Deer clan and then left and went down to Florida and lived as an outcast for the rest of his life, the Deer clan could still exact retribution against the Wolf clan, a person of equal rank. So that meant that that fellow from the Wolf clan who went down to Florida left knowing that one of his clan's members was going to get killed in his stead. So when you apply that to European law, all of a sudden, you know, major conflicts arise. And you will see here shortly how that led to serious conflict. As time progressed, we came to the time that the French and Indian War occurred, and started in 1754. And the Cherokees were allies of the British. The Cherokees fought against the French, side by side with the British. And in 1758, Richard Paris, who was the first settler in downtown Greenville, at this point he was living in Knoxville on the island in the Holston River. And he was leading a group of overhill Cherokees to attack Fort Duquesne. And here you can see in the distance Fort Duquesne. Fort Duquesne's in Pittsburgh, is at the juncture of the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers, which forms the Ohio River. Fort Duquesne had total control over those rivers. But Fort Duquesne had a huge weak spot, and that was that the overlooking hills completely dominated the fort. So if you attacked it from the landward side, then Fort Duquesne was defenseless. So Richard Paris led a group of Cherokees to the brow of the hill overlooking Fort Duquesne. Now you can tell these are Cherokees because Cherokees shave the sides of their heads. They had just a single top knot. They had the exact opposite hairdo that I have. They used clamshells, sharpened clamshells that they traded with the coastal tribes to shave the sides of their heads. So if you see a picture of a Cherokee and he's got long braided hair, that's not authentic. This is the way the Cherokees looked. As soon as the defenders of Fort Duquesne saw the Cherokees on the brow of the hill, they jumped in their ships and sailed down the Ohio River and abandoned Fort Duquesne. And Richard Paris was the first European to be inside that fort. And the Cherokees saved the day from that. So while the Cherokees were up in Pennsylvania, conquering Fort Duquesne, some of their horses got stolen. About 30 of their horses got stolen. So they start coming back down south, and in Virginia they start asking the settlers there, who stole our horses? And they're like, we don't know who stole your horses. And they're like, well, what clan was it that they belonged to that stole our horses? And Virginians say, clan? We ain't got no stinking clans. And the Cherokees were like, oh, we're all one clan. So Therefore, to the Cherokees, that one clan is responsible for the stealing of the horses. And as the Cherokees came into North Carolina, they stole 30 horses from the folks that were there. And if there's one thing the North Carolinians cannot stand, it's horse thieves. And so a shooting war began between the Cherokees and the North Carolinians, and about 25 North Carolinians were killed. So then the Cherokees come back to South Carolina, and wherever they were, there were three groups of Cherokees: the Lower Town, the Middle Town, and the Overhill Cherokees. Kiowee was the capital of the Lower Hill Cherokees. The governor of North Carolina was infuriated over what happened. The governor of South Carolina was infuriated over what had happened. So they embargoed the Cherokees. They said, we will not trade with you until you turn over 25 warriors for us to exact retribution upon. It was a demand of blood. And the Cherokees were like, well, we can't do this. They did turn over 2 guys, but that wasn't enough. So there was a delegation of Cherokee leading men. Now, Cherokees did not refer to any of their leading men as chiefs. The Cherokees were an absolutely free society. If you wanted to follow a leader, you were totally able to do that. But if you ever changed your mind and you didn't want to, you were okay to do that too. It was the ultimate exercise in freedom is how Cherokees did that. And they did not call their leading men chiefs. But about 25 of their leading men came down to meet with the governor in South Carolina, and they said, what can we do? What can we do? We are as your children. How are we going to resolve this situation? And the governor said, there's only one way to resolve it. You've got to turn over 25 of your warriors. And they said, well, we'll have to go back and talk about it back to Kiowee. And the governor says, okay, that's fine, you do that. And the Cherokees were there under a white flag. They knew what that was. And he says, but the people in South Carolina are just really mad at you guys. I'm going to send an escort to, let you go back to Kiowee. During this time, there was a British fort at Kiowee, right across the Kiowee River. It was Fort Prince George, which the British had built in 1754 to counteract French influence. And the British government also set up a fort in Tennessee on the banks of the Little Tennessee River, 150 miles away. This was Fort Loudon. So these two forts were built to counteract French influence. As the escort and the Cherokees were heading back up on the Cherokee Path, about the time they got to the Orangeburg area, the escort captured the Cherokees and held them in hostages, tied their hands behind their back, and marched them up to Fort Prince George, and threw the 25 men in a guard room that was built for 6. And at this point, there was an absolute uproar in amongst the Cherokees, and they did go on the warpath. And on February the 1st, 1760, that's when the Long Canes Massacre occurred, as the backcountry settlers were leaving to go into Augusta. And the tail end of that wagon train got stuck in the mud, and the Cherokees attacked and killed 23 of the backcountry settlers. And among these, John C. Calhoun's grandmother was, Catherine Calhoun was one of them killed. Women and children, young children, and they were killed and they were scalped. 3-year-olds were scalped. what kind of a person would scout a 3-year-old? What kind of a coward would do that? And that's the European way of thinking. To the Cherokee way of thinking, what kind of a coward would allow a 3-year-old to be scouted? The most valuable scouts to the Cherokees were the infants and the old ladies, because that meant that the men did not protect their vulnerable members of their group. This is one of hundreds of ways that the Cherokee mind and the European mind are so totally different. So 2 days after the Long Cane Massacre, there was the attack on Fort Gowdy down at 96. So, you know, that was another action during this particular time period. Again, the Cherokees sent out a white flag. They wanted to have a parley with the commander of Fort Prince George. That was Lieutenant Courtmore. So they put up the white flag, and Lieutenant Courtmore walks out of the fort, and he's talking with the Cherokee leading man, when all of a sudden warriors rise from the bank and they shoot Lieutenant Courtmore dead. And the Cherokees had broken that truce, that white flag truce. As soon as that happened, all the hostages within the fort were immediately killed. And again, and so, you know, Fort Prince George was totally surrounded. It was besieged. Fort Loudon in Tennessee, it was surrounded and besieged, and the war was on. Archibald Montgomery led a 1,200-man army from Charleston to Fort Prince George. He broke the siege there, and he continued to raid and destroy some of the close Cherokee towns, then marched up to try to relieve Fort Loudon. And he got a little ways past Franklin, North Carolina, at a place called Ochoe Pass, which is real narrow and real steep. And at that point, that's where the Cherokees had set up an ambush, and they defeated Archibald Montgomery, even though he declared victory. And he had to retreat, and he retreated all the way back to Charleston, leaving Fort Loudon to their own devices. And that siege lasted for 4 months, when a truce was arranged whereby the defenders of Fort Loudon would leave all their arms and ammunition in the fort, and they would be allowed to walk back to Fort Prince George. And after they got about 10 or 15 miles away from the fort, the Cherokees discovered where the defenders of that fort had buried arms in the floor of the fort. And so therefore, they broke the terms of the agreement, and they attacked the garrison as it was leaving, and 23 of those men were killed, and some of them were killed in a very gruesome manner. Some of them escaped. Well, now there's another army that's of about 2,000 strong. Francis Marion's in this army, Andrew Piggins is in this army. They're coming up through to chastise the Cherokees based on what events had transpired to this point. And here you can see Fort Prince George. There's the town of Tomasi. These are other towns that are in Pickens County, particularly Estatoy. Seneca is right here. That was an important town as well. So I'm going to read to you what happened as James Grant and his army came through. This happened right here in Pickens County. And it's a letter that James Grant wrote to Lieutenant Governor William Buell on the 4th of June, 1760. We marched at 8 at night through the woods in order to surprise Estatoy, which by that road was about 25 miles from our camp upon the river. we proceeded directly on our march to Estatoy and found a few houses upon the road just deserted. The beds were warm and everything left in the houses, which you may believe did not escape. We arrived early in the morning at Estatoy, which was abandoned about half an hour before. 10 or a dozen of them who had not time to escape were killed. The towns, consisting of above 200 houses, well provided with ammunition, corn, and in short, all the necessaries of life, plundered and laid in ashes. Many of the inhabitants who had endeavored to conceal themselves, I have reason to believe, perished in the flames. Some of them I know of for certain. In order to continue the blow and to show those savages that it was possible to punish their insolence, we proceeded on our march and took all their towns in our way. And every house and town in the nation shared the same fate with Estatoy. I could not help pitying them a little. Their villages were agreeably situated, their houses neatly built and well provided, for they were in the greatest abundance of everything. They must be pretty numerous. Estatoy and Sugartown consisted of at least 200 houses, and every other village at least of 100 houses. After killing all we could find and burning every house in the nation, they had at both Estatoy and Sugartown plenty of ammunition which was destroyed, and everywhere astonishing magazines of corn in which all were consumed in the flames. They had not even time to save their most valuable effects. The soldiers found money in many houses. 3 or 4 watches were got, their wampum, their clothes, their skins, and in short, everything. Many loaded guns went off when the houses were burning. So that was the treatment that James Grant gave to the Cherokees. And that's the first Cherokee War, the Cherokee War of 1766. And, the Anglo-Cherokee War is what it's referred to. The second Cherokee War was the Cherokee War of 1766, and the same treatment was given to the Cherokees at that time. One thing on this map I would like to show you is this was the boundary line in 1777 that was established during the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner when the Cherokee War of 1776 was ended. This northern portion here remained Cherokee territory until 1816, when it was sold to the United States government in the Treaty of Washington for $5 million. And that's 10 cents an acre is what that turned out to be, which probably was a fairly fair price at that time. This is one of the reasons for the American Revolution. That's what this map shows. And that is this line right here. It's the proclamation line of 1763. When the French and Indian War ended, it ended in the Treaty of Paris in 1763. There was 2 treaties of Paris. The king decreed that there would be no European settlement beyond this point. This also shows, I could have shown this at the beginning of talking about the French and Indian War, but I'm showing it now. This part, belonged to Spain. This part was French, and Florida was Spain. It's not shown that way on this map, and this was England. The French and Indian War was a world war. Britain had a lot of enemies. The French and the Spanish and the Dutch were absolute enemies with Britain. And this carried over until the American Revolution. And in many regards, the American Revolution is just tying up loose ends of what happened in the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War in Europe began when Prussia attacked Austria. And in Europe, there were major battles with 100,000 men on each side. There were 6 of them. And as a result of all those battles and all those activities in Europe, not 1 square inch of territory changed hands. But in America, there was a massive changing of hands. When you look at this, all of this area, French, okay, they controlled the St. Lawrence River, and they were down here in Louisiana and Mobile and that sort of area. All of this was French. This was British. At this time, there were 2 million English settlers along the eastern seaboard. The French had a total of 30,000. So they weren't that much of a threat. They were a threat to England. They weren't a threat to the folks in the backcountry of South Carolina. Again, this was Spanish during the French and Indian War. England conquered Cuba, and to give Cuba back to the Spaniards gave Florida to the English. Florida, there was 2 colonies in Florida. East Florida with the capital in St. Augustine, West Florida with the capital in Pensacola. And Florida was a thorn in the side to the Patriot forces throughout the entire Revolutionary War. But that proclamation line, you know, really upset the settlers around Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, not so much South Carolina as you can see. And that was a primary reason for the Revolutionary War. When you look at this, these are the counties in South Carolina in 1760. There's 4 of them. You know, Craven, Berkeley, Colleton, and Granville. If you had business, you had to, you know, conduct your business according to what county you lived in. So if you live here, what county is that? Or here, or here, or there. In 1755, a Treaty of Saluda was conducted with the Cherokees. Now, there were 32 different treaties with the Cherokees, and most of them were very unsuccessful. The Treaty of Saluda, however, was very successful. It lasted for 22 years. Many of these treaties were lucky if they lasted 6 months. But during that time, the area that later became the 96th district was sold by the Cherokees to the British colonial government. Now, I've read the Treaty of Saluda, and it's extremely vague. It says that the colony is buying this land in, as a result of gifts and other considerations. So what does that mean? It means that the British colonial government could interpret the treaty any way that they wanted. Of those 32 treaties, no Cherokee ever read one of those treaties until at least 1780, 1785. There were a few Cherokees who could read at that time. Now, the time of 1800, the missionaries came in from the Moravian missionaries. They were teaching English, and the Cherokees adapted to European ways. But all of those treaties, even though they were making their mark, they were read to them, explained to the Cherokees. And another factor was the boundaries of these treaties were just extremely vague. There was no surveying. That's why you have these county lines that look like this that just suddenly stop. There was no surveying in the back country. And if I could have time to explain to you why the state of South Carolina border looks like that, then you'll understand the problems with surveying. You know, while this area was now open for European settlement. You know, to the people in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania was full. Virginia was pretty darn close to full. North Carolina was getting full. Now all of a sudden we've got this area right here, Virgin Territory, and folks came down from the Great Wagon Trail to the backcountry of South Carolina. This was the frontier of America from 1755 to 1777. Now 1777 till about 1781, Pickens County was the frontier of America. This was the virgin land for any settlers in this area. So while this area was open for settlement, it was a very chaotic time. You had some of the best people in the world moving into this area, and you had some of the worst people in the world moving into this area. There was no government, there was no law back here. If somebody stole your horse, what you were supposed to do was take a week and go down to Charleston, file a complaint, and then take another week, go back home, and a few weeks after that they may send out a patrol, or they may not. So it was just completely lawless. There were all kinds of highway brigands, road Cherokees, road Creeks, road Shawnees coming down through this area. There were Europeans dressed as Cherokees committing robberies in the area. So what happened was, you know, the leading men in the backcountry, and we had militias formed during this time, they banded together and they formed a group called the Regulators. And this is the beginning of the Regulators movement. Now there was a Regulators movement in North Carolina at the same time. These are two very different movements. But in South Carolina, the Regulators were a vigilante group. And if they suspected somebody of being a horse thief, they would go and they would tie him to a tree and they would whip him. Or if somebody was a wife beater. Or if somebody was going through the territory that they weren't supposed to be, they would quickly escort them out of the territory, making somebody else's problem. And the Regulators movement, you know, they were effective for a while, but like all vigilante movements, they got totally out of hand. And they got so far out of hand that a counter movement arose in opposition to them called the Moderators. And in 1768, there was a real standoff between the Moderators and the Regulators. And it was eventually resolved. As a result of the Regulators movement, the British colonial government knew that there was a problem with governing, so they created the 96th district in 1769, along with these other districts. And a courthouse was built here in 96. It was built of brick. It was 3 stories tall. There was a brick courthouse. This was there was no other brick feature in South Carolina. And the settlers came from miles around just to sit there and stare at it. So that was part of what was going on with the Regulators movement. Government acts that led to a conflict, and I'm going to go over this quickly. Governor Boone dissolved the legislature in South Carolina. You had the governor that was appointed by the king. And you had a privy council, 10 men who served under the governor, but they were discredited because of scandal. But the Commons House of Assembly was an elected body of wealthy coastal elites called the Rice Kings that did have the power to tax and apply that tax to public works activities. Now, the governor had the power to tax. He could tax from up above, and I'm going to be talking about that a little bit. but the Commons House of Assembly also had the power to tax. The Privy Council had veto power over the Commons House, but they were really ineffective. And the governor had veto power too. I talked about the proclamation line of 1763. The first tax was the sugar tax, and it was on luxury goods that had very little effect on the backcountry of South Carolina. The stamp tax was a major problem, created a major uproar. This is when the Sons of Liberty was formed, and they're the ones that had the crescent symbols on their liberty caps, which was the most ridiculous looking things you ever saw. But they had that crescent symbol on there. It's not a moon, it's not a gorget, it's a crescent. In 1766, the stamp tax was repealed. But then there was another series of taxes, the Townshend Acts, and they were individuals. There were a tax on lead, you know, one after another. And lead was ammunition, a tax on ammunition. These taxes were to pay for the French and Indian War, which the backcountry settlers didn't much care who won that war or not. The Regulators movement, Regulator Moderators War, 96th District created. The Wilkes Fund controversy probably should be first. I told you that the Commons House of Assembly had the ability to raise taxes for public works activities. Well, the Commons House decided that it'd be just a wonderful idea if they took 10% of their budget and send it to John Wilkes over in England, who was, on trial for his speech being too free. And, you know, it's kind of ridiculous that this government in South Carolina is sending money over to England. And the governor disbanded the Commons House because of that. And the issue was, over the rights of the governor, an appointed official, versus the rights of elected officials. And since 1771, there was such an impasse that there were no bills passed. I mean, the government was totally ineffective for the past 5 years, for the next 5 years. Charleston Tea Party, 1773. The Intolerable Acts passed for Boston. There were 25 British colonies in America. 13 of them rebelled, which means that 12 of them didn't rebel. 5 in Canada, 5 in the Caribbean, and 2 in Florida. And the way the colonial Britain was dealing with these governments was individually. You know, here's our laws for Boston, these laws are for Charleston, we got some laws over here for Virginia. They wanted the colonies to be individuals. This is why the United States is such a radical vision. And during the time that the rebellion was going on, these folks were referring to themselves as associators. And they were going around trying to sign people to oaths of association. So anyway, 1774, First Continental Congress, these are extra-legal bodies because the government was actually non-existent for 5 years. And so they started forming their own bodies. The Council of Safety, for instance, was extremely important. It was just a bunch of coastal elites who got together. Henry Lawrence was the president, and they operated under the terms of martial law. And they were very dictatorial, more so than the British government ever was. Drayton, Hart, and Tennant was a mission to the backcountry of South Carolina to convince the backcountry to rebel against Britain. And I'm going over, well, no I'm not, that clock got a little glare on it. I'm going to wrap up my introduction to the prelude to the war with Governor Campbell escaping to the warship Tamar. You know, in colonial South Carolina, there was not a yoke of British oppression. There were 3 British officials in South Carolina. There was the governor, the attorney general, and the customs officer. We weren't invaded with Britain. Now, in Boston, this is a totally different case. In Boston, it was extremely oppressive. That's where the American Revolution started. But we saw the handwriting on the wall. But the only British officials in South Carolina, you know, there would be some soldiers around the customs house, and there were warships in Charleston Harbor that was enforcing the trade agreements with the coastal elites, or the Rice Kings. The coastal elites were chafing under the British export and import policies. They wanted free trade. And this is what they were, you know, fighting for so much, is they wanted that free trade. So, in the backcountry, though, people just basically wanted to be left alone, and you know, just do their own thing. There's a lot of talk about the reasons for the American Revolution being for freedom, and you know, we all love freedom. But if you really wanted to be free, you would go and you would leave with the Cherokees, because they were free. They had absolute freedom. You know, do I have freedom to, I have freedom to swing my fist as much as I want, but that freedom ends at the point of another man's nose. So there are limits on freedom. And I've been talking with some of my cohorts. You know, one fellow says, well, we weren't fighting for freedom, we were fighting for liberty. And liberty is freedom with responsibilities. So, okay, so what's the responsibility? Can I, you know, drive two miles an hour through a stop sign, or 5 miles, or do I have to stop? What is my responsibility there? Who decides that responsibility? What the American Revolution was about, particularly in the backcountry of South Carolina, and this is semantics, I know, but it wasn't necessarily freedom, and it wasn't necessarily liberty, but it was absolutely the right of self-determination. Who is going to decide for us whether we should stop at that stop sign or not? And a king who inherits his power, or the people who vote for that power amongst ourselves? And the thing of it is, I would like for everybody to realize, when the Declaration of Independence was signed, July the 4th, 1776, it wasn't like we just flipped a light switch and it was freedom and liberty and self-determination in the United States. It wasn't that way. South Carolina was an aristocratic society. And aristocracy, class systems were the norm. That was thought to be the way things were to be. And in South Carolina, we had the coastal elites, the Rice Kings. We had the yeomen, farmers, and homesteaders in the backcountry. And we had the slaves. We had very distinct 3 classes of people. And these classes were codified by law. The South Carolina 4 constitutions, the Constitution of 1776, the Constitution of 1778, 1868, 1895. The constitutions of 1776 and 1778 defined who could hold office based on the amount of wealth you had. And wealth was measured in slaves to a huge degree. It determined who could vote based on the amount of wealth that you had. You could only be a white male. Well, there were some free blacks who had enough property and they could vote. Gradually, those voting restrictions got reduced, but it was a long period of time. The coastal elites dominated the provincial government, while 50% of the population lived in the backcountry. There was 20% representation in the backcountry. So it was slowly, equality was slow to get here. You know, black men could vote in 1868. It was still 50 years before women of any color could vote. That's only been for the last 100 years. So, again, it was a series of baby steps. And I'm so happy that we got here. And the thing that has been so wonderful about us getting here has been the Constitution of the United States. And I firmly believe that that's the greatest document that mankind has ever produced. Other than the Bible, which was produced by God, the Constitution of the United States is the greatest document we've ever produced. And it's been in effect for 235 years. No other country in the world has had a constitution that's been in effect for 235 years. So it is not perfect. It was a compromise. It totally ignored the slavery question, and that took a civil war to determine. But if you don't like the Constitution, you can change it. And it's been changed 25 times. But the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, the Third Amendment. Anybody know what the Third Amendment is? Nobody knows what it's never been applied. It's the Quartering Act. That's a Boston thing where government troops cannot be housed in your homes because of the Third Amendment. But the Fourth Amendment, strictures against illegal search and seizure, that's a biggie right there. So that Bill of Rights and our Constitution is what has made America great. And I'm so happy we've got to that point, this point. We're still working on it, but it's an evolving thing. And I think it's, you know, nothing but good things, even though there are some bumps in the road. But that's my thoughts. People ask me about my political affiliation. I tell people that I am a flaming moderate. So, for whatever that's worth. I've told you about, I won't be talking about that anymore, I promise. But I've told you about the field trips that I undertake. And to me, this is where the action is, folks. You ain't going to be going to sleep on these field trips, I assure you that. And there's one coming up this weekend. And again, this is a newly discovered battlefield that we have just found in the last 6 weeks. There's been a lady, Nancy Lindroth from Augusta, looking for this battlefield for 20 years. And the reason it's been so hard to find is because there are 10 Patriot pension applications and memoirs describing this battle. And every one of them's different. And they are just all over the place as far as where the location of this was. And until we found this out, it was thought to be in McCormick County, but it's in Abbeville County. And it's right across the Anderson County line. And I'm giving a lecture on the Battle of Dunlop's defeat this coming Friday at 7 o'clock. And I do encourage you to take a picture of this on your phone so you'll have that information if you're not writing it down. But Friday at 7 o'clock in Simpsonville, at the Simpsonville Revolutionary War Museum, I'm going to be describing the events that occurred at the Battle of Dunlop's defeat. And then Sunday at 2 o'clock, we're going to be walking that battlefield. And you'll be able to see you'll be the first visitors to an actual Revolutionary War battlefield here in South Carolina. So here are some other field trips that we've got coming up. Now the way I've arranged this schedule is I'm giving this same discussion in Spartanburg on the third Thursdays of the month. And the battlefield walks are going to be the Saturday following the third Thursday. This is getting complicated, I know. This discussion was originally discussed, and I'm going to be here in Easley the Tuesday before the third Thursday of every month. You with me? No? The reason this discussion isn't next week is because next week is Valentine's Day, and that preempts my discussion here. And I'm so grateful that all of you folks showed up tonight and instead of watching the State of the Union address. Golly.
Hard decision.
But next Saturday the 25th, and I'm doing these battlefield walks in order that they occurred during the Revolutionary War. And one of the very earliest battles happened in southern Greenville County at the Battle of the Great Canebrake. And that was a major battle. I'm going to talk about it some more next week. That may be where we start. And then in Fort Lindley was a fort in Lawrence County, and I'm the caretaker at both of these sites. But Fort Lindley was a fort that was attacked by the Cherokees during the Revolutionary War. And a lot of people, I didn't know that. I didn't know that until I started doing this. And then the next day, we will be going to Fort Rutledge on the Clemson campus. And that's where Seneca was. Those two places are together. And then we'll take about a 30-minute drive up to Tomasi and see the ring fight where Andrew Pickens was so heroic. That's a fascinating spot, folks. One thing about the Cherokees, they pick the most beautiful places in the state to have their towns. We're going to see some wonderful scenery, if nothing else. I do need to back up just a little bit and tell you one thing about the Battle of the Canebrake. That occurred in a floodplain bordering the Reedy River. And with January being the wettest month of January that we've had in recorded time, I mean, the Canebrake, flooded not too long ago. I mean, it's a muddy mess, and it takes four-wheel drive to get down there anyway. We may have to pass on that, and may have to do it at a time that is drier. But I do field trips roughly every 2 weeks. If you friend me on Facebook, you will see my schedule. I will be posting these schedules at the end of the lectures from here on out. But I think you really get a lot out of these. On Sundays, starting with the second lecture, second through third and fourth lecture, we'll be going to Kings Mountain, Cowpens, and 96. And on those days, the National Park Service is closed. We will have those parks to ourselves. And that's pretty good. Does anybody have any questions? I like questions. I know I didn't answer everything. Yes?
Let me ask a question. This is just kind of general, but we always talk about battles.
Yes.
What constitutes a battle versus a skirmish?
Next question.
I mean, is it a meeting engagement between two squads of soldiers, or?
That is a very difficult question to answer. I don't know.
Well, if you don't know, who knows?
I don't think anybody does. Okay, Jack Parker has written the Bible on the Revolutionary War in South Carolina, and I'll probably show you that book, and every one of y'all needs that book. It lists every battle by every county. It lists the Pickens County battles. It's got 4 in Greenville County, 24 in Spartanburg County, and so forth. So he lists 500 Revolutionary War events. So, is a beating an event? Is a hanging an event? I mean, there is no clear definition whatsoever between, battles. I would say if it's, well, that's not a clear point.
Who fought in the Battle of Canebrake?
Who fought?
Yeah.
That was a battle between the Patriot militia and the Loyalist militia in the 96th district. And that was started with a conflict over how to deal with the Cherokees. I'm going to be discussing that at length next talk. Anybody else?
I'm just curious about why it's called the 96th district.
Okay, the question is why it's called the 96th district. So in 1730, a fellow named George Hunter was tasked with the job to survey the 96 path. Survey the Cherokee path. And you can see on this that 96 is denoted right there. But several stories about the Cherokee path. One is that a Cherokee maiden warned her British lover that an attack was going to occur, and she rode 96 miles on her horse from Kiowee to the settlement of 96 to warn her British lover. Another story is that George Hunter, when he was surveying that path, he determined from the gait of his horse that 96 is 96 miles from the capital of Cherokee, of Kiowee, down to the settlement there at 96. Now, I've measured that distance. It's 73 miles. I think we're going to have to change the name. Another theory is that on the Cherokee path, this settlement, and see, 96 was a trading center. It was one of the most prosperous areas in the backcountry. And it was so prosperous and so settled that that's why they put the courthouse and the jail there. There were 12 houses at 96. It is on Long Cane Creek that there were 9 creeks that forked off to the left or to the south, and then 6 creeks that went to the north, and there you were at the town of 96. The reason has been lost to history. It's been lost to history, yes.
Within our general area here, though, we have Mile Creek, we have 6 Mile.
Yes,
We have 18 Mile Creek.
Yes, you do.
3 and 20 Creek, and all of those originated from Fort Prince George.
no, they originated from Kiowee,
Well,
the same place.
yeah, before Prince.
Right, right. Yeah, they all, that's where you get the names of these creeks, because that's how far they are from the Cherokee capital, or Fort Prince George. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for your attention.